Delivered by Dr. Dallas O Dell. Dallas is a postdoctoral researcher at ICTA studying framing and communications of degrowth and its policy proposals. She is interested in exploring avenues to make the degrowth narrative more appealing to the working class and others for whom the agenda may not currently inspire hope. She recently completed her PhD at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her thesis attempted to bridge the gap between psychological and behavioral science literature focused solely on individual level sufficiency behaviors and system level change through degrowth endorsed in other disciplines. So the real project, Post-Growth Deal, is funded by a European Research Council synergy grant delivered to Professors Jorgos Kallis and Jason Hickel at ICTA-UAB and Professor Julia Steinberger at the University of Lausanne. This lecture is being recorded. Dallas will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes. So save all your clarification questions for the end, and we'll move straight into a discussion from there. Take it away, Dallas.
Awesome. Thanks, Charles. All right, let's see how this works. Perfect. So Charles has already introduced me a little bit, but I'm an environmental psychologist by training, and I've come to ICTA to do some more interdisciplinary work with a particularly applied focus. And my research will focus on framing and communications, as Charles mentioned, about degrowth and its main policies, including the jobs guarantee, universal basic services, universal basic income. But in order to undertake this experimental research on framing, I'm first working on some projects that delve deeper into people's perceptions of degrowth, particularly with a focus on the working class. And much of my interest and motivation in understanding policy perceptions, creating better framing interventions, and especially centering the working class perspectives derived from the paper that I'll be presenting today, which was part of my thesis research. So here's the paper. It's entitled Public Support for Degrowth Policies and Sufficiency Behaviors in the United States, a Discrete Choice Method. Experiment, excuse me. It's available open access through the Behavioral Ecological Economics Special Issue. And my collaborators were Dr. David Kantu, who was at the Canadian University of Dubai, and Dr. Ganga Sridhar, who was one of my supervisors at LSE. And I should note that this research was funded through LSE. So I began this research about 1 year into my PhD as I was getting deeper into the literature on degrowth. And at the time, there was not one study that examined the general public's perception of specific policy proposals that were being put forth in the degrowth literature. And as a psychologist, I found this quite surprising, especially given the emphasis in the literature on democratic deliberation and bottom-up organizing. And while a few studies were subsequently published, there were still several gaps that remained. And one main gap was particularly relevant to my thesis, as Charles has described, which was the connection between people's everyday behaviors to reduce their own consumption, such as sufficiency-oriented behaviors, and their support for transforming society in line with degrowth. And there was also no research in the United States, which is where I am from, unfortunately. So I won't go too much into my thesis context. Charles already gave a bit of an overview, but it was essentially to kind of bridge the gap between these two literatures, one in the psychological and behavioral sciences focused on individual behavioral change towards strong sustainable consumption or sufficiency, and whether that facilitated or undermined system level change toward degrowth, which was primarily in the ecological economics and political ecology literature. And I was focusing really on our understanding and perceptions of institutional changes that might facilitate consumption reduction within degrowth. While the paper had several research questions, the one I'll focus on today is how does the adoption of sufficiency or reduced consumption behaviors relate to policy preferences? So most of you, I'm sure, will be quite familiar with the idea of sufficiency, which entails both an environmental component and an equity component. But we conceptualize sufficiency as a change in consumption behavior that fell within 4 categories, as outlined by Maria Sandberg's paper in 2021 on sufficiency transitions. So in this paper, sufficiency included absolute reductions, modal shifts to less energy-intensive forms of consumption, extending product longevity, and sharing goods or services with others. And so we constructed a questionnaire based on these 4 categories to create a composite measure of engagement in sufficiency behavior. And I won't go into more details on this measurement exactly, but you can find more in the paper. So we theorized the association between sufficiency behaviors and policy support for degrowth policies based on Yorgos, Giacomo, who are both on the Real Project, and some other colleagues' work in the Case for Degrowth book from 2020, of how lifestyle changes could facilitate system change as opposed to being a direct route to mitigation. They surmised in this simple illustration that lifestyle changes, such as those for sufficiency, could lead to a reassessment of societal values, which may bring about an enhanced politicization, which we see as relating to policy support, for example, which could provide then the preconditions for transforming society toward degrowth. It is worth noting that they didn't necessarily detail sufficiency behaviors or policy support as the necessary instruments, and they did suggest other lifestyle changes such as commoning and other forms of politicization such as direct action. But we generally called this trajectory a sort of behavior to transformation pathway. So there is mixed literature in the psychological and behavioral sciences on how pro-environmental behavior, of which we can consider sufficiency behavior a form, and environmental policy support, of which we can consider support for degrowth policies. So there's some evidence that suggests that pro-environmental behaviors might lead to lower support because people already felt they've done enough. Other evidence suggests that pro-environmental behaviors can catalyze support, for example, through people's desire to be internally consistent. But based on this sort of transformation pathway that we theorized, we hypothesized that engaging in sufficiency behaviors will increase support for alternative degrowth policies over the status quo. Our methodology consisted of a literature review to first determine the most appropriate policies in the degrowth literature, selecting specific policies and specific levels of those policies, and designing an experiment along with a reasonable policy scenario. And then we looked at qualitative focus groups to test the feasibility of the policy package that we had created and the specific policy levels that we'd selected, and I'll explain those a bit later. And finally, we ran the discrete choice experiment to collect and analyze the data. Whilst we didn't do a formal thematic analysis of the focus group data for the paper, I wanted to just discuss some themes that did emerge anecdotally here to give a bit more context. So the focus groups were conducted in the summer of 2022 before we then collected data in September and October. And in addition to refining our policy instruments based on this focus group feedback, the themes that emerged also definitely structured our understanding of the qualitative data. So first, people definitely lacked trust in government to make changes that benefited everyday citizens, as opposed to focusing on their own interests or those of lobbyists. Second, participants supported the ideas and values that underpin the policy changes, but they had little faith that enough other people would support them as well. Third, when discussing what role each individual might play in transforming society toward a more sustainable and equitable one, people focused much more on their own individual pro-environmental behaviors and much less on anything political or oriented toward collective or direct action. And finally, in presenting many of these policies, a primary concern was how they might be funded and whether this would mean burdening off the worst off in society, especially with some form of a tax increase to pay for the policies. So using a discrete choice experiment was quite complicated for several reasons, especially given some obvious limitations that I had to consider. So the main one was really using a method that was underpinned by neoclassical economic theories, such as utility maximization and the insatiability of demand, which were quite epistemologically incoherent with the degrowth agenda and its heterodox economic underpinnings. This also meant that the way we were modeling the policy package with the personal income tax as the monetary attribute was not necessarily reflective of how such a proposal would ideally be funded as described in the degrowth literature, that is through public financing as demonstrated by modern monetary theory. However, the literature on degrowth policy perceptions did, in my view, need a more systematic means of understanding support, especially involving trade-offs between policies, and the DCE really enabled that approach. I also saw an opportunity to present public preferences and perceptions of degrowth policies to more mainstream economists who might have dismissed methods that were less rooted in economic theory. So it was definitely a trade-off. And while using a personal income tax may have been more burdensome and less popular, this wouldn't at least overinflate the estimates, which we thought would be more detrimental. And I won't have time to go into the actual design of a DCE and the specifics of how one constructs one, but please do refer to the paper as we've gone into more detail there if you're interested. So there are obviously many policies that could be included based on the vast literature of degrowth policies, but we selected what we considered was an ideal set within the limits of the DCE design and what we felt was realistic and necessary for the US setting. So this included a mix of social and ecological policies to reflect the eco-social nature of degrowth's agenda. The first two that we have here are work time reductions and fossil fuel limits. So work time reductions entailed 3 levels from 35 hours a week to 28 hours. And fossil fuel limits ranged from an annual cap to an outright ban on new extraction and production. Whilst this policy is definitely less common in some more recent policy conversations of degrowth, I did consider it essential for the US landscape, given its continued expansion of fossil fuel production. The next policy was restrictions on advertising for high emissions goods, which range from removing these ads only in public spaces to an outright ban on any ad of this sort. We also included healthcare to signify a component, obviously not entirely, but one component of universal basic services as a policy, which we believed essential and very relevant for the US context. So this ranged from expanding access to Medicaid to 500% of the federal poverty line, which would have been about 140,000 household income for a family of 4, to universal coverage regardless of income. So based on the DCE design, we also did need to include a cost and a benefit to create this sort of trade-off. So as a benefit, we created different emissions reduction targets for the year 2030, which ranged from 50% to 70%, and this was based on a reduction from 2005 emissions levels. And these figures came from the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed in 2022, and this act really acted as the main policy scenario that we used for our experiment. So the method also required a personal cost to make policies feel consequential to participants who were taking the survey. But we did want to impose some progressive component to the tax. So we imposed 1, 3, or 5% tax increases for the 99%, or people who made less than $600,000 a year, and 3 times those increases, so 3%, 9%, and 15% for those top 1% of income earners. So here's an example of a choice card that participants would have received. And they would have had to select option A, option B, or the status quo. So the choice card included the same categories, which you can see in the rows on each card, but what changed would be the specific levels within each of the boxes. For only option A and option B, status quo always stayed the same. And each participant answered 8 of these choice cards, and there were a possible 40 variations. So some results. I'm going to move on to sharing some selected results, but I can't go over everything really, and I can't go into much detail given the time. And there were several other analyses for other hypotheses as well. So as I said, please do refer to the paper if you want a bit more information. So we used YouGov to recruit a sample who ended up also partnering with Cantor. And we hoped for a nationally representative sample from the US by age, gender, and region, as this was what they could offer us. But our final sample that consisted of 1,012 participants was mostly representative of the US population by gender and income, though it tended to be on average older, more white, more non-Hispanic, and more college educated really than the American populace. They were also on average political centrists, so 5 out of 10 on a scale from 1 to 10 was by far the most commonly selected category, where 1 was to the left and 10 was to the right on the political spectrum. So one of the analyses we ran to determine the association between sufficiency engagement and degrowth policy support was a random parameters logit model, where we included an interaction for whether the participant had engaged in sufficiency behaviors. And we had 2 models, a binary measure, so engagement or non-engagement, and a continuous one, so how frequently they had engaged over the last year. This model assumes heterogeneity in preferences. So it determines an average point estimate as well as a standard deviation for each policy attribute and each interaction term with sufficiency. So people who were more engaged with sufficiency generally significantly preferred the set of policies, these alternative policies over the status quo. They preferred a full ban on fossil fuels to a cap, and they were less sensitive to tax increases to fund the policies across both models. For the binary model alone, those who were engaged in sufficiency preferred a general ban on ads to a public spaces only ban. And for the continuous model, having engaged in sufficiency more frequently was associated with support for the shortest work weeks over the longer ones. So these results really do suggest a positive association between sufficiency and policy support, which would support our hypothesis. Another analysis that we conducted for this hypothesis was a latent class analysis, in which preferences are predicted through class membership. So it's a probabilistic model, which means people are not directly assigned to a class, but rather given a probability of being included in each class. The researcher must then select a number of classes. So we tested models between 2 and 5 classes, and our final model consisted of 3 classes with covariates to describe class membership that included sufficiency engagement, as well as education, age, and employment. So here's a results table. I won't dwell on it too much. It's a lot of numbers. But we can basically see that there are 3 classes with different significance levels for the various policies in the upper panel, indicating whether they significantly preferred a given policy change. So you can see that class A only significantly preferred resource limits. I don't know if you can see my stars, but it's right here. Sorry, my mouse, I mean. Class B didn't significantly prefer anything over the status quo, and class C preferred most of the degrowth policies, really, except for limits on advertising. On the bottom panel, you can see the interactions with our covariates. So the coefficients indicate a comparison with class B. So that's the reference group, and that's why there are no numbers for class B in the bottom panel. So you can see that the typical degrowthers in class C have significant and positive coefficients for sufficiency engagement and a significant negative coefficient for employment, which means that on average, they were more likely to be engaged in sufficiency and less likely to be formally employed than class B. Class A were also more likely to be engaged in sufficiency and less likely to be formally employed than class B as well. And we've given names to each of the 3 classes. So we have dedicated environmentalists, opponents, and typical degrowthers based on their policy support and sufficiency engagement. So to summarize, participants in the sample had a 21% probability. Sorry, I'm just moving my thing so I can, yeah, perfect. They had a 21% probability of being a dedicated environmentalist who were more likely to practice sufficiency, but the only policy they supported was the cap on fossil fuels. Then there was an 18% probability of being part of the opponents group who were unlikely to have practiced sufficiency or support any policies. And finally, the largest probability was being a typical degrowther at 61%, who were likely to practice sufficiency and be supportive of most degrowth policies, except for the restrictions on advertising. So to better understand the composition of each class, we used the probability of class allocation and placed respondents into a class if they had an 80% or higher probability of falling into a given class. So this meant around 200 respondents were excluded from this analysis. And we then compared each pairwise combination of classes by using a t-test to determine whether the average characteristics of the pair of classes significantly differed. This analysis was ultimately placed in the appendix of our paper by the request of a reviewer, but I really wanted to discuss it here a bit further, given how it's really related to my research objectives as I move forward in my research. And it is worth noting that because it's a follow-up study, there's a lot of carryover assumptions and it uses simple t-tests, so I wouldn't consider it as rigorous as some of the other analyses that are presented in the paper, but I still believe it's quite useful. And it's illustrative, I think, of a lot of larger issues that degrowth has that can be backed up in other papers in the literature. So compared to the dedicated environmentalists and typical degrowthers, the opponents in Class B on average had significantly lower belief in climate change. They were less likely to believe that poverty was beyond one's control, and they had lower trust in government, were older, and were typically further to the right politically. Meanwhile, compared to the dedicated environmentalists in Class A, the typical degrowthers in Class C were on average, they held more progressive values. So they had higher voluntary simplicity values, were typically further left on the political spectrum. They had more progressive poverty beliefs, and better climate knowledge. And demographically, they also tended to have significantly higher income, higher educational attainment, and were less likely to be Hispanic or Latin American. So there's obviously a lot to discuss about these results, but some of the main takeaways for me were as follows. First, there was definitely more support for degrowth policies in the US than the media or literature might suggest. And this is backed up by some other analyses in the paper, which I have not shared here. There was a consistent support for some form of restrictions on fossil fuel production and extraction, which shows opposition to the ever-growing production of the US oil and gas industry in the past several years. It seems that an eco-social transition of the fossil fuel industry could act as a unifying issue to build a broader coalition of support for degrowth across people of different demographics and values, at least on the center left. The link between sufficiency behavior and policy support seems positive here, whereby campaigners might advocate for fossil fuel restrictions alongside sufficiency-oriented organizations, or by appealing to people's desire to adopt sufficiency-oriented lifestyles. However, for the wider set of eco-social policies, the link between sufficiency at the individual level and support for policies is not necessarily as clear and should definitely be approached more cautiously. So it seems that there are two distinct strategies that might emerge, where for higher SES and more progressive people, sufficiency behaviors could still be a viable pathway for building support around degrowth policies. And the focus on sufficiency for this group is also important given their higher average emissions levels. And for those who are very affluent, their greater visibility on average might lead to a greater influence in shifting other people's behaviors, values, and norms. Conversely, though, for those with lower SES and less progressive values, focusing on sufficiency seems like it may crowd out support for more socially oriented policies and issues, including things like universal basic services and work time reductions. And as these policies are really key for transforming society, more work is definitely needed to determine the best political strategies for mobilizing this group toward degrowth. But the standard environmentalist appeals focusing on individual consumption behavior are really unlikely to work, I would say. So I was recently asked how these results were possible given Trump's recent election victory. And I will caveat all of this by saying that it is my personal belief and not necessarily reflected in any of this research, obviously. But I believe the difference really is that the paper assessed perceptions and support for specific policies. And neither party in the US presidential race really put forth a platform based on policy. So the Trump campaign was focused on ideology and a sort of cult of personality and really distanced himself from any of the policies that began to emerge from Project 2025. And the Harris campaign seemed to be mostly preoccupied with defending against a Trump victory. So I see this research as measuring a very different set of values and attitudes or beliefs as what the American electorate were voting on. And this is backed up by some data. So amongst 18 to 29-year-olds, a typically progressive age group, Trump won 50% of their vote in 2024, increasing from only 30% of this age group in 2020. And many of these voters appeared to diverge from their beliefs on key issues and policy solutions associated with climate and the economy. Many even said they wanted more government intervention on healthcare and student debt. And these policy goals would appear quite coherent, I would say, with the results of our study. So whilst I'm no political strategist by any means, I would suggest that the Democrats' lack of specific policies to improve people's well-being, protect the environment, and ensure economic security might have pushed people to abandon traditional views on these key issues in favor of Trump's narrative that seemed more compelling to protect their livelihoods. I will very quickly just go through some other limitations. This is my second to last slide. So we couldn't test a causal link between sufficiency behavior and policy support, which does definitely limit its interpretation. And as I noted, the sample could have been more representative, especially of racial and ethnic minorities and less educated people, which I think should definitely be prioritized in future research. As I mentioned, also, I think some of the most interesting findings derive from a less technically rigorous analysis, this individual probability analysis that I have shared, which is, somewhat unfortunate, but I think worth discussing. And finally, studying societal transformation toward degrowth is somewhat limited if we're only looking at focusing on policy change. And there are other arguably more important mechanisms such as direct action or really changing political systems more broadly. So moving forward on the real project, I will really try to shed light upon these underlying reasons why people with less privilege might have lower support for degrowth and its policies. I really believe this is a pivotal step for building a much needed working class movement behind degrowth. And it seems like this is really currently missing both in the literature and in the movement in general. I believe using more qualitative research methods will help me to gain a deeper understanding of these perspectives as well. And with these insights, I then plan to construct value-based policy frames and test some novel metaphors to build better communication strategies for the degrowth movement, and really to shift the way we conceptualize economic growth and prosperity. All right, thanks so much for listening, and I'll take any comments or questions now.
Wow, Dallas, thank you so much. We're going to head straight into clarification questions. So if anything wasn't clear to you, you'd like Dallas to expand on something, you can raise your hand using the react button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go in order. Any clarification questions for Dallas? If there aren't, if everything was crystal clear, then we would open this up for discussion, so you could ask more open-ended kind of content questions. And if you simply had a reaction and wanted to build into the discussion, that's welcome too. Let's start with Firoz. Go ahead.
Oh, I can't. I don't think I can hear you, Frost.
He's here.
Hello,
Big
yes,
reveal.
we are a full 3 meters from each other. Thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to maybe clarify, but also ask you to develop a little bit. So it sounds like the group of typical degrowthers were about 61% of the sample, and you were looking at the overall composition of the sample, and it skewed a little bit older and more white than the population average. And I guess in the context of what we have been discussing in other circles or in the general discourse around degrowth, the perception that you also highlighted is that especially like older, whiter, working class people are not going to go for degrowth or for degrowth framed policies. So I guess I'm curious what you think the implications are of like such a massive proportion, 61% of people ultimately having some latent support for degrowth. And what does that tell us about, like, how does that intervene in the debate on whether degrowth is popularly supported by this specific demographic of people? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Faraz. Yeah. So one thing I should clarify that I didn't necessarily say explicitly is that I did not use the word degrowth anywhere in the experimental materials. So I didn't explain one of the hypotheses and one of the other parts of the research, which was a degrowth framing that didn't use the word degrowth, but it just tried to explain the sort of principles and ideas around the agenda and issues with economic growth and alternatives to economic growth as a main policy objective. So and that framing actually was pretty insignificant. It didn't have much of an impact either way. So I do think that there's a bit of a tension, right? So I think that people, if it's characterized in the right way, degrowth is, I mean, obviously I'm biased. I think it can be appealing. I think a lot of it is really around the communications of degrowth and people feeling like they're not part of some movement or feeling like it doesn't appeal to them for some preconceived notion. I think that's a lot of it. So when you take away those preconceived notions and you focus on specific policies, I tend to think that people will react more positively to the policies as a baseline than maybe thinking about this sort of scary alternative of transforming their society, you know, to change at such a large scale, I think can be quite intimidating for people. So I do think that there are kernels of the agenda that appeal to most people, but I don't think that it's unclear at this point to me. I don't think I have enough information to know what the sort of most appealing components of the agenda really are. And that's kind of why I'm continuing the research on perceptions, especially amongst the working class, because I think it could really go both ways. So I think that there are some policies, like I think a jobs guarantee. I actually spoke to my aunt when I was back in the States, who's a big Trump supporter. She loved a jobs guarantee. She thought it was a really great policy. But she really hated UBI and she really hated anything that sounded like a government handout. So I think that it's kind of about disentangling, not making it such a all-encompassing movement that people have to be pro all of degrowth or anti all of degrowth, and understanding the nuance a little bit more and seeing where we can draw people in on different edge issues and understanding how that can make, you know, this idea of a pluriverse of different perspectives and a degrowth for different people coming to it from different perspectives. But I still think it's unclear, and I think I need more data to really say definitively whether, you know, how the working class really relates to it. I don't think I can answer that fully.
Thank you. Let's go to Giacomo and Yorgos.
Hi, Dallas.
Hi,
Thank you
Giacomo.
for the presentation. Well, I have a question and a commentary. Perhaps I will wait for the commentary in the second round. Now I will focus on a question. But I don't know. I didn't understand if there is in yours survey now a way to capture the performativity of specific value, because what I was at least understanding from your presentation is that we are speaking at the level of values, no? In most of the questions. And I think we nowadays in most of Westernized society, we live in a very dissonant system in which people can really be on board on specific values and also in general discussion. But then in terms of performance that are in line with that values is pretty difficult. So the problem of testing just the value is that then you don't know how these people perform in their everyday life. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know if there is some way to capture these differences and see if there is dissonance among those people that are associated to a specific group or another.
Thanks, Giacomo. Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of I see Anna is here, and I think a lot of, and she will relate to this, a lot of psychology research does suffer from this gap between sort of self-reported ideas around values, intentions, maybe attitudes, and then really measuring some sort of real, you could call it behavioral or call it performative or actualized evidence of the way people say they feel. I do think that's a main limitation of this study. There wasn't really a way for us to capture behavior in terms of how people had actually engaged in sufficiency. So it was self-reported. And in terms of policy support, I guess we try. These are things that the discrete choice experiment attempts to mitigate by having these sort of consequential questions. So by having costs and benefits, it tries to make it feel a bit more real. And like it might have some trade-off. So they won't just say yes to everything. And there are some checks that you can do on how, excuse me, how consequential or how realistic people think the questions are. But I don't think there's a good way of getting at what you have said. And I agree that this is a main issue with survey research. Yeah.
I don't know, but just I was thinking, for example, if you test the word time reduction and you say, okay, I'm in favor, perhaps you can ask how many times in the last year you have decided to reduce your time of work instead of working hard, for example. No, it's this kind of possibility could introduce some relational analysis between what they perform and what they think it could be the policy, no?
I agree, but I would say with a lot of these policies, and I think a lot of, you know, the approach to degrowth in general, it really does have to come at a more structural level. So I don't know that people, I know plenty of people who support the idea of work time reductions, but would not do so unless they felt their boss told them to, essentially, or they felt it was law. I think they would be afraid to take that action themselves, fearing, you know, being penalized at work or something. So I think it is difficult maybe when it comes to policies to expect people's behavior, and this is where the kind of tension between behavior and policy really comes out, is people's behaviors might not come before the policy comes, and they need that policy. Even if they believe in the policy, they might not act in a way in line with the policy until it's passed, really, until they feel it's, you know, changed at a higher level. So I think with creating more of a connection between behavior and those sorts of policies, I think it is quite difficult.
Anna, go ahead.
Hi everybody. Hi Dallas. Thanks for the really cool presentation and congrats on the paper as well. It seems super relevant from the point of view that you mentioned also of rooting political campaigning in clear policies that reflect the values that apparently a quite big share of the population already holds. I was going to ask a question about interpretation, I guess. So I think this is a super cool starting point in capturing the relationship between sufficiency behavior and policy support. I was wondering about directionality. So you did observe a quite tight link between sufficiency and policy support, but how can we really say which one comes first, I guess? Is it that people behave in a sufficiency manner and therefore they become more prone to support environmentalist or degrowth kind of policies? Or could it be the other way around, that maybe high support of policies and ideas in general of degrowth and environmentalism then leads people to tend to behave more in line with these values they have, and therefore support for these policies? And I was wondering whether you have thought about ways that maybe this could be disentangled further in further studies, that maybe, I don't know, use interventions to check that what's the directionality here, so which comes first in this two points link between sufficiency and policy support.
Yes, thank you, Anna. Definitely, and that's kind of why I mentioned the lack of causality, because I think that that's an obvious weakness of this paper for sure. And I did spend a lot of time thinking about the best ways of measuring sufficiency behavior and went through a couple different experimental designs. And ultimately, all of the sufficiency behavior measures just seemed very, I mean, even this one, I would say, seems a bit superficial. But I think my focus really was on the sort of policy design and adding sufficiency as one component. So I totally agree that there is a directionality issue, and it is quite hard to tell which way it goes. I think based on the way we had theorized it from Yorgos's work and Giacomo's work, we imposed a bit of this direction where we thought the behavior then might change the politicization that might lead to broader transformations. I have definitely thought about, and this was something that we got from reviewers as well, less so the directionality and more just causality issues. And so I have thought about some other ways of measuring at least a causal link, which might then be able to say some sort of directionality. And there are some, measures where you could have people make a decision that would be sufficiency oriented or not, and then measure their support. I think it's all a bit imperfect. Part of me feels though, I guess this is not particularly scientifically rooted, but just given the lack of awareness that a lot of people have for degrowth and the policies that we presented, but the fact that sufficiency behaviors are at least somewhat more available, in terms of salience, that sort of directionality seems anecdotally to make sense to me. So it would be easier for people to engage in everyday behaviors like reducing their consumption, changing the way they go to work, buying less. That feels to me, those behaviors seem more culturally salient, at least in my life, which is very biased. The policies seem more distant because you kind of have to have heard of, you have to be in a bit of a circle that's talking about policies, since none of these policies are really being debated yet. But yeah, I think a lot more work needs to be done to understand the directionality.
Great. Over to you, Lewis.
Hi, Dallas. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot. It's a very interesting presentation. Hold on. Yeah, sorry. So I think it's more of a clarification question, but I'm kind of interested in what the framing was of the sufficiency items in the survey. Because if I kind of look at your list here, it seems that some of them could be for reasons other than ecological reasons, like primarily kind of financial reasons. So I was wondering, was that distinction made, for ecological reasons?
No. So we didn't frame it as saying, have you done any of these in the following to reduce your environmental impact or to engage in more sufficiency behaviors? We just asked the questions of how they would, how often they had engaged in any of those behaviors in the last year. And I definitely agree. And I think that's kind of the interesting thing that then does map on a bit with the results, because there is that group, class A, the sort of dedicated environmentalists, we called them, but they might really not be particularly environmentally oriented. And there is definitely reason to believe that they engaged in those behaviors for economic reasons or cultural reasons or, other preferences. So I don't think it's, again, we imposed a structure, we created meaning, and we called it sufficiency behaviors based on, the literature and our understanding. But I don't think that it has to be, it's not clear what the motivation was. And we did ask, after we asked those questions, we did ask, how effective do you think that these behaviors would be in reducing your environmental impact, I think. So only after they had answered their behaviors, they did get some feedback or information that they were environmental. But I don't think that might have directly impacted the way their motivation for answering them in the first place.
Okay, thanks.
Dallas, we have a few questions from the chat, so I'm going to read these out if that's okay. Martin asks, during your focus group and testing, did you receive any questions, skepticism, or concerns about how these suggested policies would be implemented in relation to, for example, finding funding, current systems, and structural limitations? I think you alluded to that, but maybe you can say a little more. And then Marina has 3 questions, which I guess I'll read out and you can answer them, kind of pick at whatever seems most pressing to you. She asks, how does your thesis relate to Inglehart's post-materialist thesis from the 1970s, which has been challenged by Martinez, Allier, and others? Wow. 2, will you measure the gap between environmental opinions and actual environmental change, for example, individual emissions or different environmental footprints? That's the second question. And then 3, our time series analysis in the 2000 to 2023 Gallup poll, US co-authored with Dan Brockington and Forrest Fleischman, finds that low-income individuals consistently prioritize environmental protection over economic growth, even when controlling for political ideology, education, race, and gender. How does this align with your findings? If you didn't get any of that, just flag it and.
No, I can see them. I got it. Yeah. Okay, so on the first one about funding concerns, this was definitely something that came up in the focus groups, and I think it pretty consistently comes up whenever I present policies and ask for sort of support or perceptions. And I think it's a difficult one to tackle without really doing an entire course on, monetary policy or economic theory. I think it's really difficult to simply convey how you would fund these policies, especially because I think that's still kind of working theory in the degrowth literature. So I do often kind of sidestep that question, which I think I would like to in the future work on a better explanation of how to go about explaining it. But I think it really comes from a sense of fear and uncertainty, and fear that any change might make people's daily lives worse off, at least in the short run. And I think these are exactly the kind of economic trade-offs that I'm very interested in digging deeper into, especially considering this sort of working class group. I think that there is very good reason why people might be skeptical of how to fund these policies or how these policy changes might impact their daily lives. And I think we need more information to really kind of unpack what they're concerned about and how we might go about addressing those issues as a degrowth movement and thinking through them and not just sort of kicking the can down the road a bit. But it is a main concern, I would say, amongst people, especially in the US, which is where I've done more research. Okay, for Marina's questions, so I have finished my thesis, so I won't be measuring any gap in opinion versus actual environmental change. Sadly, that ship has sailed. I have read a bit of the post-materialist work, but it's really not my area of expertise, so I can't say much about this, but it's something that I will definitely look into. If you want to reach out and have a chat about, we definitely can. In terms of the time series data from Gallup, I think this is quite interesting, and I do think that there's a lot of competing evidence. So I've seen some work that says very clearly that I think it was a European values survey, research using the European values survey that said the opposite of this, that people of lower SES and less progressive values did not support economic or environmental protection over economic growth. So, and I mean, it might be Europe versus the US, it might be how the data is measured, it might be specifics of how the question is framed, but I think there's a lot of inconsistency in the literature with regard to how people of less advantaged backgrounds view economic growth and environmental protection. I also do think that the sort of general ideas around the growth versus environment debate might differ from people's perception of specific policies. So I think that the point is that more research needs to be done, and that's why I'm quite excited to be continuing this research in my postdoc, because I think it's a much more complicated scenario, and it's much more diverse depending on geography, depending on background, depending on all these different demographic factors. And I think it's hard to say with one, broad stroke what the direction of the effect is. But I think the point is that lower income people often are not given place in data analysis in the way, and definitely policy analysis. And so that's why I really think it's an important area to continue research. But sorry to not give a very satisfying answer to any of your questions.
Yeah, brilliant. You were rigorously disciplined in your time management, Dallas. So so we're doing well. If either of you wanted to react to that, please feel free. And if not, Jacqueline, I remember you said you had a comment, but let's go to Leah first.
Yes, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to comment on this last point about knowing whether low-income individuals prioritize environmental protection over economic growth when controlling for lots of things. I was just wondering whether maybe by controlling for all these things, this might actually like remove the effect that you would, ever be able to measure. So by controlling, for instance, for ideology, maybe this is one of the most important causal pathways. Or let's say education, maybe these are pathways that are important to explain why low income individuals would not prioritize environmental protection over economic growth. So I think maybe some of the inconsistencies that you can find in these studies actually comes from the fact how control variables have been selected, and that actually depending on what control variables you select, you will basically block certain causal pathways, or you would leave them open. I don't know whether this makes sense to you, but I'm sorry, maybe I'm unclear, but what I want to say is that sometimes it's not good to control for too many things if those are actually those that are meant to explain the effect that you see in the data.
I very much agree. Yeah. And I think, especially political ideology is consistently one of the main predictors of support for, the environment over economic growth or degrowth policies.
Yes, exactly. That's what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah.
I think it's a very good point. Yeah. And I would say so as well.
Okay. Joel had a question about the opening you made at the end of your presentation, Dallas, with regard to the rise of the far right in the US and how they are often kind of appealing to the issues that degrowth tries to address. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit. And one maybe a bridge I wanted to make there was the argument I hear you making for a very kind of materialist approach to degrowth to make a case that appeals to people's lived reality. So it's kind of like a classic like left bread and butter political appeal. And I've been reading Richard Seymour recently, and he writes about kind of disaster nationalism and the far right context that you're talking about. And he points out that while bread and butter keeps us full, it doesn't arouse past passions in us, and that like passion is something that the far right is very good at. So I wondered if you had any ideas about how we kind of catalyze desire for degrowth and an enthusiasm for these ideas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charles. And yes, so I guess on the point that Joel's making about Trump, I would say yes. I think he's hitting on a lot of social issues that are, I would say that there's somewhat economic issues, thinking about how immigrants are taking jobs, or thinking about how tariffs are increasing prices, or that we need tariffs to reduce prices or whatever. But yeah, social and economic issues, I think that the far right now actually has diagnosed the problem quite well. I think their solutions not so much, but I think that that's really why they're appealing to people. And I don't think that there's a compelling counter narrative on the left. Definitely not by the Democrats at this point. So I would definitely agree. On the point about arousing desire or hope, I don't have yet a good answer. That is something I'm really, really keen to figure out in this postdoc. And that's kind of why I'm excited to do some more qualitative work, because I don't think that that's going to come out in a survey, and I don't think it's going to come out through quantitative data analysis, which was primarily what my thesis used. So one thing I do want to look into more is aspirations, because I think that there are a lot of aspirations amongst working class people that have been very co-opted through neoliberal ideology to think that we need sort of a more acquisition-oriented means of success. So you show prosperity and success by buying more and consuming more. And I do think that if we can get more insight into sort of what these aspirations really underlie or where they come from, and think about alternative aspirations, and imagine, what the exciting future of degrowth might actually look like, then we can maybe build some momentum around that. But I think right now there is no real compelling vision of the future amongst the degrowth movement that replaces the sort of general, and these are not just working class aspirations, these are middle class aspirations, really, of acquisition and consumption. I think we need to really imagine how we would replace that, and then build momentum and hope for a world where people's needs are met, their wants and desires are met through non-material ways. But I just don't know that the current way the degrowth narrative has discussed it is compelling enough. But I don't have a good answer, and I'm very curious. I think what I can say is that the way it's being described right now in degrowth literature and the movement, or however you want to call it, I don't think it inspires hope in people who don't have enough privilege to be able to imagine an alternative in a less material way. And so I think the bread and butter issues are getting people to that material standard, obviously. But I agree. I think that there is a bit more that needs to be done to inspire some sort of excitement of, a non-acquisitive form of prosperity.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dallas. I think we're gonna leave it there. Marina just wrote that she's on maternity leave, so congratulations, Marina, and thank you so much for your questions. Thank you everyone for the discussion. Round of applause for Dallas. And as I wrote in the chat, all of these public lectures will be uploaded to the ICTA YouTube channel, and we'll be back once a month. So thank you everyone for attending, and have a brilliant rest of your week. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for all your questions as well.
Thanks, Dallas. Nice work.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks, Charles, for facilitation.
Yes, thank you so much, Charles. See ya.
Thank you, everyone. Congratulations, Dallas.